What's going on, filmmaking homies? It's your boy Cody Blue, and today we're gonna kind of revisit a video that I did like a year ago about how to set up your Sony camera for filmmaking. Now, the reason I want to revisit this topic is because number one, I got a new camera, the Sony a7 III, but also number two is because that video must have been a little bit confusing because a lot of you guys were asking me questions saying you couldn't figure out how to save the settings or you couldn't figure out why you can't change your shutter speed, and basically it must have just been a little bit confusing for you guys. So I wanted to revisit it and basically walk you guys step by step through how I'm setting up my a7 III, both for filmmaking and also for photography. So for those of you guys that are on the 6300, the 6400, or the 6500, you might notice that the menu on the a7 III is a little bit different, and there's probably some additional features and different things like that. But for the most part, you should be able to follow along and still get your camera set up the exact same way that I'm setting up my camera. So with that being said, it's probably not going to be the most entertaining video. It's just going to be pretty much an overhead shot of how I'm setting up my camera. So a little bit boring, but hopefully you guys will find this video useful and it will help you guys get your camera set up and ready to go. So let's get into it. All right, so setting up your Sony camera for filmmaking. Now, I'm gonna try to make this as easy as possible for you guys. I'm not going to explain every single thing that I'm doing. I'm just gonna show you guys exactly how to set up your camera step by step. That way your camera will be set up the exact same way that mine is. But let's go ahead and jump right in. So the first thing you wanna do is put on a lens that has a large aperture. So whatever lens you own that has the largest aperture, put that lens on your camera, whether it's f1.4 or 1.8 or even f4, whatever your largest aperture is, put that lens on your camera. Then we're gonna wanna make sure we go to our dial and switch it over to the movie mode. I think in my last tutorial, I recommended using the M mode, but things have changed and now we're going to use the movie mode. Once you've done that, we're ready to jump into the menu. Now, the actual goal of setting up our cameras for filmmaking is to make things as easy as possible. We basically want to be out in the field and know exactly what we're looking for when we're looking for it. So what we want to ultimately do is make sure number 2 on our camera is set to 1080p at 120 frames per second. This is going to be our slow motion mode. And then we want to make sure number 1 is set up to 4K at 24 frames per second, and this is going to be what we shoot all of our regular speed footage in. So it makes life super easy. If you want to shoot regular speed, put it in number 1. If you want to shoot slow motion, put it in number 2. But in order to set everything, we want to make sure we're starting in movie mode. So now that that's out of the way, let's go ahead and take a look at the menu. So like I said, I'm not going to go into too much details in today's video because a lot of it doesn't exactly matter. If you have any specific questions, let me know, but I'm just going to run through my menu and tell you guys what you need to change in order to set your camera up for filmmaking. So the first thing we're going to want to change is make sure we set our aspect ratio to 16:9. Moving on to the next page, we really don't have to touch any of this stuff. Moving on to the next page, we really don't have to touch any of this stuff either, but I want you guys to make a note, this memory option on the first tab and the third page is how we're going to save our settings. So keep that in mind, we're gonna come back to that once we've set everything else. Moving on to the next page, none of this stuff really matters. Moving on to page 5, we wanna make sure our focus mode is set to continuous autofocus. Priority set is a balanced emphasis. And then for focus area, this is gonna be kind of up to you, but if you guys wanna know how I do it, I like to use the zone autofocus area for pretty much all of my video shooting. So either I'm using zone or I'm using manual focus. Those are pretty much my only 2 focus options that I use when I'm shooting video. Otherwise, the rest of this stuff, we're not gonna change. Moving on to page 6, not really anything we need to worry about here. Moving on to the next page, I like to make sure I have pre-autofocus turned off, and the rest of the stuff doesn't really matter. Autofocus micro adjustment, we're not gonna deal with that. ISO, you can go ahead and set your ISO to ISO 100, but just keep in mind when you're shooting in Cine 4, which is the picture profile I'm gonna recommend for you guys, it's going to default to ISO 200. ISO 200 is the lowest that you can use for Cine 4, but for the meantime, just go ahead and set it to ISO 100. Next, again, none of this stuff really matters for video. Moving on to page 11, none of this stuff matters. Page 12, white balance I set to auto. I shoot probably 95% of my videos in auto white balance. If for some reason it's giving me trouble, then I have a custom button that I use to change my white balance, which we'll talk about once we get to the custom button section. But for now, just go ahead and set it to auto. Priority set is standard, DRO is off, creative style is standard, picture effect is off, and picture profile, I am still using my custom Cine 4 picture profile. I'm not gonna tell you guys all of those settings in today's video, but just know those are the settings that I'm using, and I will go ahead and put these settings down in the description below for you guys. So make sure you set that picture profile. It does not matter what number it is set to. I have it set to PP1, but you can set it to any number. It doesn't make a difference. Moving on to page 13, focus magnification time, I have set to no limit. Initial focus magnification is 1x, and focus peaking, this is your peaking setting. Now personally, I use a monitor when I'm shooting videos, so I don't use focus peaking on my Sony camera. But if you don't have a monitor and you wanna use focus peaking, go ahead and set it to however you like, and then you can save that to your menu settings. But personally, I'm gonna go ahead and leave that off. This stuff doesn't really matter. And moving on to the second tab. Now this is where we get into some of the important stuff where I think a lot of you guys were getting confused in my previous videos. So the first page, this exposure mode, we wanna make sure we are in manual exposure. I've gotten a lot of questions from you guys asking, how come when I'm shooting videos, I can't change my shutter speed or change my aperture or something like that? And it's most likely because you don't have this set to manual exposure. So exposure mode is manual exposure. File format, we're gonna do XAVCS 4K. And I shoot all of my 4K footage in 24p at 100 megabits per second. S&Q settings, I'm not gonna touch it. Proxy recording, this is up to you guys. If you have a slower computer, you might record proxies. It might make your life a little bit easier, but for me, my computer seems to handle things pretty well. So I'm gonna go ahead and leave that off. On page 2, autofocus drive speed is normal. Autofocus tracking sensitivity is standard, and auto slow shutter is turned on, even though we're gonna be using manual settings, so this doesn't really matter. For audio recording, obviously I have that turned on, and my audio record level is about 10 or 12. I'm just gonna go ahead and leave it on 12, and then of course in the field, when we're actually shooting, we can change our audio record level based on how loud or how quiet we need it to be. And audio level display is gonna be turned on. This basically just means I can see my audio bars here on the screen, which allows me to make sure my audio is not peaking. Moving on to page 3. All of this stuff doesn't really matter. You can just leave it to the default stuff. Page 4, SteadyShot, obviously you wanna have turned on, or in some cases you may wanna turn it off, but I usually like my presets to default to SteadyShot being turned on. Zoom, for your zoom setting, you wanna make sure you have it on and set to clear image zoom. Page 6, for zebra settings, now again, I use a monitor, so personally, I don't use zebras on my Sony camera, but if you want to use zebras and you don't have a monitor, I recommend setting it to on with a custom zebra level with a lower limit of 100 plus. Now this works great for my Cine 4 picture profile, but if you're using a different profile, you might wanna refer to somebody else's zebra tutorial. Grid line, I use the rule of thirds grid, and exposure set guide I have turned on. This stuff doesn't really matter. So moving on, let's talk about my custom buttons. Now I pretty much use the same custom buttons for both photo and for video. So I'll just run you guys through those real quick so that you can see how I'm setting them up. So my control wheel here is set up to control my ISO. That way I don't have to click the ISO button. I just turn the wheel and it changes my ISO. My custom button 1 is set to my white balance. Again, I usually shoot in auto white balance, but if I need to change it, I do have a custom button set up for that. Custom button 2 allows me to switch from APS-C mode to full frame mode. This just allows me to zoom in on prime lenses and different things like that, punch in a little bit tighter if I need to. Custom button 3 is my autofocus manual focus control toggle. That just lets me turn autofocus off and turn it back on. Super easy. Custom button 4, which is this trash button, is set to touch operation selection. Basically allows me to turn my touch screen on and off if I find that it's being annoying or getting in the way, something like that. My multi-selection center button, which is this right here, you push it down, is set to my focus standard. So if I want to reset my focus back to the center, I just click that button and my focus moves back to the center. My center button is set to my audio record level. This allows me to quickly change my audio levels on the fly without having to dig into the menus or anything like that. My left button is set to the drive mode, doesn't really matter. Right button is set to ISO, doesn't really matter. My down button I don't have set. And the rest of the stuff is basically photography related, but since we're gonna talk about photography in today's video as well, we might as well go through it. So my AE lock button is set to I autofocus, my AF on button is set to autofocus on, and my focus hold button, which is usually a button on the lens, is set to focus hold. So those are all the custom keys that I'm using for both photos and for videos. But let's continue setting up our camera for filmmaking. So we'll go on to our last page here. Movie button, always. Audio signals, I like to have mine on so that I know when I'm recording and when I'm not recording. And that's pretty much all we have to set in the actual menu. So we'll go back to our main screen here and change just a few more things. So the first thing we want to change is we want to make sure we're using the appropriate shutter speed. So for 4K, we want to use 1/50 since we're shooting at 24 frames per second. Now aperture, like I said, you should have on a lens that has a large aperture, and then you want to crank that aperture all the way down to as low as it will go. This basically forces our camera to default to having the lens wide open. No matter what lens you put on there, whether it's 1.4, 1.8, or f4, it's always going to default to that largest aperture. And then if you want to change your aperture, you can do that, but it depends on the type of look that you're going for. Personally, I like to have my lenses default to being wide open and then change my aperture as I need to. And then of course, lastly, the ISO is going to be ISO 200. Like I said, because we're shooting in Cine 4. So now our camera is set up and ready to go for 4K filmmaking. Now we just need to save this to number 1 on our dial. So we're gonna go back into the menu and we're going to go to tab 1, page number 3, come down to this memory option, and then we are going to save this to the memory slot 1 by pushing the center button on our camera here. But first, go through and make sure everything looks correct, all the settings look correct, and then push the center button, and you will have number 1 ready to go for 4K filmmaking. Then we have to go back into our settings and get everything set up for 1080p filmmaking. So we'll go into our menu, we're gonna change our file format to XAVCS HD, make sure it's set to 120p. We're gonna change our shutter speed to 1/250. And the last thing is our picture profile. We wanna make sure our detail is set to 0 for slow motion. So I recommend -6 for 4K and 0 for slow motion. So once we set that to 0, we'll go back into our menu again, go back to our memory setting, and we will save that to the number 2 slot here. So again, make sure all the settings look good and press the center button. And now our camera is ready to go and set up for filmmaking. So if you want to shoot slow motion, you just go to number 2. If you want to shoot regular 24 frames per second 4K footage, you go to number 1, and you pretty much won't have to change anything else except for maybe your white balance, ISO, and aperture. But that makes filmmaking pretty easy on the A7 III. So now let's talk about my photography setup. Now for the most part, I really don't have to change too many settings. I'm just gonna click my dial over to M, which is the mode that I shoot all of my photos in, and then I'm gonna change a couple of the menu settings. So first things first, for photography, we wanna make sure we're shooting in RAW, and I like to use the uncompressed format, but if you have smaller SD cards or you're worried about space, go ahead and shoot compressed. I'm not sure if anybody can really tell the difference, but yeah, so RAW and uncompressed. For aspect ratio, I wanna make sure I'm in 3:2, and the rest of the stuff I'm not really going to change. My focus mode, I'm gonna leave continuous autofocus. My focus area, I like to use the expand flexible spot. This just gives me a specific focus point with a little bit of flexibility. And the rest of them, I pretty much am not gonna change. Everything else stays about the same. And then pretty much the last thing that I need to change for photography is I wanna make sure my picture profile is turned off. But otherwise, I'm shooting everything pretty much totally manual, so none of the other settings really matter. I just wanna make sure my picture profile is turned off, I wanna make sure I'm shooting in RAW, and I wanna make sure my focus mode is set to expand flexible spot or whatever focus mode you prefer for photography. But otherwise, I'm just gonna leave all the settings just how they were for when I set it up for filmmaking, because I'm gonna be controlling all of my exposure and all of that different stuff with manual settings. But that's how I'm setting up my A7 III for filmmaking and photography. Hopefully this eliminates all questions about the menus and camera settings and different things like that, because I'm a little bit tired of talking about it, but hopefully this video helped you guys out. So there you go, guys, how to set up your Sony camera for filmmaking and also the little changes that I'm making in order to get it ready for photography. So hopefully this eliminates most questions that you guys might have. But if you have any specific questions about why I'm using a specific setting or why I'm changing this or what does this setting do, then just send me a DM on Instagram at CodyBlue_, and I'll try my best to reply to all the questions that you guys have. But that's all I had for you guys in today's video. So do me a favor, like this video if you liked it, subscribe if you want to see more, and until next time, we'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace out.